Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, it's pretty simple. We take this huge stack of complex, interconnected stories that are unfolding all over the globe.
And it is a huge stack today.
It really is. We're looking at everything from breakthroughs in, super high-speed flight to the energy needs of advanced AI, all the way to these geopolitical fault lines that are just cracking open major governments in Europe.
And our job is to distill all of that down into the essential knowledge you need.
Yeah.
We're talking about everything from storing solar energy in, and this is a quote, billions of hot rocks.
I love that.
All the way to tracking potential military movements around the moon. So we're really going to be your guides through the science, the politics, and all these really profound shifts happening right now.
Our goal is always to deliver those crucial nuggets of insight and, connect the dots in a way that helps you see the bigger picture. But before we get into all the high-stakes stuff, the politics, the tech, let's start with something beautiful, an astronomical spectacle that's actually rooted in the very forces we're trying to understand out in space.
A really spectacular appearance of the Northern Lights. It's a great place to start.
Yeah.
So for those of you across the United States, get ready to look up. We are looking at a really rare opportunity to see the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, much, much further south than you normally would.
How far south are we talking?
Forecasts are suggesting that on the night of November 13th, going into the 14th, 2025, you might be able to see these light shows in as many as 10 U.S. states.
10 states? That's incredible. I mean, usually you have to go to Canada or Iceland or somewhere way up north to see this. What's driving it so far down?
It connects right back to the sun. The sun is getting into a more active phase of its cycle, which means more solar flares, more of what we call coronal mass ejections.
Right, these huge eruptions.
Huge. And they throw these vast clouds of charged particles, protons, electrons, out into space. Some of them head right for Earth.
And when they get here?
They slam into our planet's magnetic field, our magnetosphere, and they get funneled down towards the poles. When those particles collide with gases high up in the atmosphere, like oxygen and nitrogen,
They get excited, they glow.
that's it exactly. They excite those gas atoms, and that's what causes them to glow in those incredible greens and pinks and purples we see.
So a stronger solar storm means the show pushes further south.
Precisely. The Earth's magnetic field is like a shield, right? It usually protects us and channels everything to the poles. But a really powerful storm can kind of compress and distort that shield for a little while.
And that lets the particles sneak in at lower latitudes.
It lets them stream further down toward the equator than they normally could. So for anyone who's planning to watch, just remember the golden rule. You need clear skies, and you need to get as far away from city light pollution as you possibly can.
Absolute darkness.
Absolute darkness.
Yeah.
It's just a powerful reminder of the raw power of space weather.
And that raw power brings us right into our first big topic. How humanity is trying to monitor and maybe even militarize the cosmos. Let's talk about this new space race because it seems to be focused very intensely on the moon.
The focus is undeniable, yeah. The U.S. military is now explicitly looking at the moon as a strategic high ground for monitoring what's happening in aerospace.
That sounds like a major shift. I mean, we're not just talking about science anymore.
Not at all. It's a critical shift in defense strategy. It's a recognition that the lunar domain isn't just for exploration.
So why now? We went to the moon decades ago with Apollo. What's changed that suddenly makes it a military strategic point?
I think it's two things, technology and proliferation.
Mm-hmm.
It's just getting cheaper and easier to get there. So you have a lot of nations and more private companies launching missions to the moon.
It's getting crowded.
It's getting crowded. So the big concern for the military is the need to track potential threats from all these different players, whether they're traveling to lunar space or coming from it.
And a threat doesn't necessarily mean a weapon, right? It could be something else.
Exactly. A threat could be a satellite that's placed in a weird orbit to spy on other assets. It could be testing of dual-use technologies. It could even just be, really bad space traffic management that endangers everyone else's expensive missions.
So this is less about building a moon base alpha with laser cannons and more about what, a cosmic air traffic control system with a defense component?
It's both monitoring and capability. You need what they call space situational awareness. You have to know who is where and what they're doing, especially when you're dealing with the really tricky gravitational environment around the moon. But the rules for this are pretty fuzzy, aren't they? That's the huge problem. There's a big legal vacuum. The Outer Space Treaty from 1967 gives some vague guidance about peaceful use, but it doesn't have any binding rules on things like, lunar mining or setting up monitoring posts.
So the U.S. is basically planting a flag saying, we are going to be watching.
It's setting an early marker. It's saying that for the sake of safety and security, monitoring is non-negotiable. And that's happening in a domain that has no established international law, which is, well, that's setting the stage for some tension down the road.
It certainly is. Let's pivot from that tension to some really positive technological leaps coming out of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, specifically their Glenn Research Center, which just won some major awards.
Yeah, these are huge. They got 2 R&D 100 awards for innovations that are, well, they're legitimately paradigm shifting.
Okay, let's start with the first one. It has a very technical name, High Rate Delay Tolerant Networking, HDTN.
The name's a mouthful, yeah. But the idea behind it is it's exhilarating. They're basically building the foundation for a solar system-wide internet.
Wow. Okay, so what problem is that trying to solve?
It's solving the fundamental problem of deep space communication, which is massive time delays and constant interruptions.
Right, you can't just have a Zoom call with Mars.
Slight chuckle.
Yeah.
Exactly. Light takes minutes, sometimes hours to travel, and your signal gets blocked all the time when planets rotate. HBTN is a protocol that's designed to tolerate those delays. It's smart, it stores data, and forwards it when it can get a connection.
And it's faster.
Up to 10 times faster than the systems we have right now for space communication.
10 times! That's a massive multiplier. And I saw that it's open source. Why is that important?
That's the key. By making it open source, NASA is creating a technical standard that anyone can use. Commercial companies, international partners, private satellite groups.
So everyone starts building to the same blueprint.
Exactly. That is how you build a real robust internet backbone that can span the entire solar system. Get everyone on the same page from the start.
Incredible. All right, what's the second innovation? Vulcan alloy. Sounds tough.
It is designed for extreme durability, extreme performance. Vulcan alloy is a new type of soft, magnetic, nanocrystalline material.
Okay, break that down for us. Why do we need new magnetic materials?
Well, think about the huge push towards electrification. We want electric airplanes, we want more efficient energy grids. All that depends on high-power motors, generators, transformers.
And the magnets inside them are the bottleneck.
They are. Most magnetic materials they stop working when they get too hot. They hit what's called a Curie temperature, and they lose their magnetic properties. That kills efficiency and reliability.
And Vulcan alloy doesn't do that.
It's engineered to keep its magnetic properties even under extreme heat. That means you can build electric components, motors, and so on that are smaller, lighter, and way more powerful because they can operate efficiently at temperatures that were just impossible before.
So this is an enabling technology. It unlocks the next generation of electric flight.
It absolutely is a powerful dual success story from NASA.
And we're seeing similar breakthroughs on the sheer speed side of things. Research is pushing us closer to true hypersonic travel. We're talking Mach 10.
The dream of Mach 10, 10 times the speed of sound, is huge. But the engineering barrier has always been turbulence. When air is moving that fast, the way it flows becomes incredibly unpredictable.
And that causes all sorts of problems. Heat, friction, stress on the plane.
Massive problems. But researchers using these really advanced laser-based krypton experiments, they found something unexpected.
What did they find?
They found that the behavior of turbulence at Mach 6, it actually looks a lot like the airflow at much slower subsonic speeds.
What's simpler than they thought?
It's counterintuitively simpler. And that is a huge relief for designers.
Why is that so important?
Because everyone assumed you'd need incredibly complex, probably heavy systems to deal with these wild, unpredictable shifts in airflow. But if the underlying physics is actually more consistent across different speeds than we modeled.
It simplifies the whole engineering problem.
Fundamentally, it could reduce the complexity, speed up the design process, and, maybe most importantly, lower the cost of developing these kinds of ultra-fast vehicles. It could move them out of the lab and onto the test range much faster.
It's a great example of how basic science can just tear down old assumptions and unlock progress. But, while the science is literally flying high at NASA, the political reality back on Earth is causing some turbulence at their facilities.
We saw that hit the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland, yeah. During the recent government shutdown, lawmakers from Maryland raised some really serious concerns.
About what specifically?
Unexplained building closures and a noticeable loss of workforce at the center.
So this is more than just the usual chaos of a shutdown. This sounds like there might be deeper issues.
It does. I mean, Goddard is a huge engine for space exploration in the U.S. It's responsible for critical missions, and it's a major source of high-tech jobs in the region.
And the lawmakers want answers.
They demanded full transparency from NASA officials. Their argument is that these disruptions, whether it's people leaving or buildings closing, don't just slow down science. They damage the local economy, and you risk losing that base of technical expertise permanently.
It really highlights how vulnerable these complex government institutions are to, political gridlock and stop-and-start funding.
It can drive your most skilled people right out the door.
From the physical assets of NASA, let's transition to the digital assets we all rely on. Let's talk cybersecurity, because CISA just issued a really urgent warning.
A really urgent one. CISA, that's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, they issued a binding operational directive.
Binding, so not a suggestion.
Not a suggestion. It's an order to all federal civilian agencies. The message was crystal clear. You have to immediately patch critical vulnerabilities found in these widely used Cisco firewall products.
Which products are we talking about?
The adaptive security appliances, or ASA, and their firepower devices. These things are, they're everywhere in government and corporate networks.
So why the extreme measure? Are these vulnerabilities that bad?
They're critically dangerous. But what makes it so urgent is the active exploitation. Cybercriminals are already using these flaws out in the wild.
So the threat isn't theoretical. It's happening right now.
Exactly. And the really frustrating part is that CISA actually alerted agencies about these flaws way back in September of 2025. The problem was compliance. A lot of agencies were just too slow to respond.
So they basically left a huge attack surface wide open for months.
They did. It's a systemic compliance failure. They were handed the fix months ago, and now the intruders are already in the house.
And CISA is worried about more than just common criminals.
They specifically called out the heightened risk from nation-state threat actors. These are the sophisticated, state-sponsored groups who are best equipped to exploit these kinds of weaknesses, to get persistent access for, espionage or future attacks. The slow patching was basically an open invitation.
And speaking of nation-state actors, we have a fascinating and pretty disturbing story about how the post-pandemic work environment created a perfect vulnerability for North Korea.
This is a really sophisticated scheme that's built entirely on the shift to remote work. 5 people just pleaded guilty to helping North Korean IT workers get remote jobs inside major U.S. companies.
So they weren't hacking in from the outside. They were pretending to be legitimate employees.
Precisely. They were insiders. This scheme involved creating fake identities, using American proxies to handle interviews and things, and then laundering the salaries. It allowed these highly skilled North Korean IT professionals to operate under the guise of being U.S. citizens.
And the main goal here was just money.
Primarily, yes, it's a revenue generation scheme. It brings in crucial, hard-to-trace foreign currency for the North Korean regime, which is, of course, under heavy sanctions.
But I have to imagine there's a huge national security risk there, too. These people had insider access.
Absolutely. Beyond the money, they gained access to U.S. corporate networks from the inside. You don't know the full extent, but whether their goal was stealing intellectual property, mapping infrastructure for later attacks, or just creating backdoors, the scheme really showed how the global, flexible nature of remote work can be. Can be weaponized.
Weaponized by hostile states to get around sanctions and compromise U.S. security. That's a sobering thought.
It is.
Let's transition now to the world stage, starting with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where the nature of the war seems to be shifting into a new and very costly phase.
It is. The recent Russian attacks on Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, they involved hundreds of drones. And that signals a really clear shift in air assault tactics.
This isn't just about hitting specific targets anymore, is it?
No, it's about overwhelming Ukraine's air defenses through sheer volume. It's a war of attrition, but aimed at the air defense systems themselves.
You force them to use up their very expensive, limited missiles on very cheap, mass-produced drones.
Correct. The goal is saturation. You send these drones in waves to deplete Ukraine's stockpile of surface-to-air missiles. That way, when the more damaging cruise and ballistic missiles come later, they have a much higher chance of getting through.
And those are the ones aimed at critical infrastructure, power, heat.
Exactly. It's a direct assault on the civilian population's ability to get through the winter and maintain basic services.
And that reality is clearly reflected in a very stark warning from President Zelensky.
Zelensky warned his allies that he believes Russia is preparing to unleash a big war on the rest of Europe within the next 5 years.
That's a major escalation in rhetoric.
It's a plea for faster, more sustained commitment. His message is, this isn't just about defending Ukraine today, it's about building a deterrent for the entire continent. He's arguing that if you delay decisive support now, you'll face a much bigger, costlier war later.
And that very urgency seems to have led directly to some incredible political turmoil in Germany, which is, the economic heart of the EU.
We saw the complete collapse of the coalition government led by the former Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And the trigger was very specific. A major disagreement over an additional 15 billion euros in aid for Ukraine.
That seems like a strange thing to bring down a government during a crisis. What was the real conflict there?
The conflict was all about Germany's constitutional debt brake, the Schuldenbremse.
The debt brake. Explain that.
It's a mechanism in their constitution, put in after the 2008 financial crisis, that strictly limits how much new debt the government can take on. It's rooted in this idea of fiscal conservatism.
So Scholz's government wanted to borrow the $15 billion for Ukraine.
And his coalition partners, who were big champions of fiscal discipline, blocked it. They said it would violate the constitutional debt brake. Scholz wanted to declare an emergency to get around it, but they refused.
So a rule designed to create long-term stability actually made the government incapable of responding to a short-term crisis.
That's the perfect summary. This constitutional rigidity created a political choke point, and the whole government fell apart over it. It's a fascinating and, frankly, worrying case study.
So what happened after the collapse? There were new elections.
Right. A new conservative government came in, led by Friedrich Merz, and eventually they managed to find a compromise. They actually amended the Constitution to allow for more flexibility, specifically for defense and aid spending.
So the system resisted, it broke, and then it reformed itself.
It did, but at a huge cost in terms of political stability and time. And they ultimately plan to increase total assistance to 8.5 billion euros by 2026, which is, less than the original proposal.
That's the tension inside the bloc. But then you have Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban isn't just resisting aid, he's attacking the entire financial structure.
Orban's position is fiercely oppositional. He called the EU's financial support for Ukraine a wartime mafia network that's linked to President Zelensky.
That is exceptionally strong language. What's he basing that on?
He's pointing to a recent embezzlement investigation involving Energoatom, which is Ukraine's state-owned nuclear operator.
So he's using allegations of corruption to justify his opposition.
He is. He rejects what he calls Zelensky's financial demands and blackmail. And he points to the huge amount of money, 177.5 billion euros, that the EU has already allocated since 2022.
And his argument is what? That the money is being wasted or stolen?
Both. His argument is that the aid is being siphoned off, and also that Ukraine is failing to meet the basic standards of transparency and good governance that you need even be considered for EU membership. And he consistently uses his veto power to block Kyiv's accession talks.
So he's creating this huge internal friction for the EU leadership.
A massive amount. This whole segment really just shows the immense pressure Europe is under. You have this external military threat from Russia, and at the same time, this internal fracturing over money, policy, and standards.
It's a real tightrope walk for Brussels.
It is. Trying to manage a war while also demanding accountability from the very nation you're trying to save.
Let's shift our focus now to the Middle East, where some very serious disclosures have come out from U.S. intelligence about military operations in Gaza.
Yeah, this is deeply serious. The information revealed that there were internal discussions among Israeli officials about the controversial use of human shields during military operations.
And just to be clear, the use of human shields is condemned under international law.
Universally condemned. So for this kind of intelligence to become public, reported by multiple outlets, it immediately raises these profound questions about adherence to the laws of armed conflict.
What are the diplomatic consequences when something like this comes out?
The implications are severe. It really complicates Israel's relationships, especially with key allies like the United States, who are always trying to balance their support with demands for following the rules of war. It just fuels international condemnation and increases the pressure for independent investigations.
And this disclosure comes at a time when there are already reports of escalating anti-Palestinian rhetoric and violence within Israel itself.
Right. Reports have been detailing this intensification of anti-Palestinian actions, described as happening with impunity even after a U.S.-imposed ceasefire was supposed to be in place.
And this rhetoric is happening at high levels.
It is. The environment has seen this ultra-nationalist discourse really get amplified within the Knesset, which is Israel's parliament.
Can you give an example?
There was one instance where a senior lawmaker was openly defending the actions of Meir Kahan, a convicted terrorist whose extremist party was banned years ago. And there were even proposals for things like the death penalty, but specifically targeting Palestinians.
So it's a normalization of extremist views in the political mainstream.
That's what analysts are pointing to. They argue it damages Israel's democratic institutions from within and isolates it even further on the world stage.
Now, for a moment of what seems like a diplomatic success, a breakthrough between France and Algeria.
Yes. French President Emmanuel Macron celebrated the release of a writer named Boulem Sansal. He's a Franco-Algerian writer who is very critical of both the French and Algerian governments.
And his imprisonment was a major point of tension.
A huge flashpoint in an already very delicate relationship. So his release is being seen as a really significant diplomatic achievement. Macron said it was secured through an atmosphere of respect and calm.
And this is part of a bigger strategy for France.
It is. It's seen as part of France's long-term effort to rebuild its relationship with Algeria. Algeria is crucial for energy and security in North Africa, but the relationship is always strained by the complex, painful history of colonialism. This is a step towards mending some of those fences.
Okay, from high diplomacy to the brutal world of the global tech trade war, we have this fascinating story about what's being called the Nexperia Civil War.
This is a really vital corner of the semiconductor industry that most people never hear about. Nexperia makes what are called legacy chips.
Legacy chips, so not the fastest, most advanced ones.
Exactly. These are the older, robust, reliable chips that you need for, well, for everything that isn't a supercomputer or a high-end smartphone.
Like what?
Cars, industrial machinery, basic defense systems, power grids, medical devices. They aren't glamorous, but they are absolutely essential. The world runs on legacy chips.
And what's this civil war about?
The tension exploded between the company's Chinese and Dutch factions. This happened after a Dutch court actually removed the Chinese ownership because of some serious governance concerns.
So it's a corporate fight with a huge geopolitical layer.
A huge one. And now there are accusations flying back and forth. The Dutch side is accusing the Chinese side of failing to honor agreements on supplying the raw materials, the wafers. And the Chinese side is accusing the Dutch management of actively sabotaging the company.
And a disruption here could be a big problem.
It could paralyze industries. The auto industry, for example, is incredibly dependent on these chips. It just shows how fragile that whole semiconductor supply chain still is. An internal business fight can become an international economic headache overnight.
Okay, let's plunge into the digital realm, focusing on this relentless race in social media and, of course, artificial intelligence.
The battle for our attention and our wallets is fierce, and the platforms are moving fast. We're seeing Meta, the company that owns Facebook, overhauling its marketplace to really lean into this idea of social e-commerce.
What are they actually doing to make it more social?
They've introduced tools for collaborative buying. So let's say you're looking at a couch on Marketplace. You can now pull your friends directly into the chat with the seller to get their opinion in real time.
Or even to split the cost.
Or even to split the cost. It turns what's usually a solo transaction into a group activity.
And this is all strategic because at its core, Meta is an advertising company.
100%. We have to remember that advertising is still the massive engine for Meta. It was 97.8% of their income as of 2023.
So more engagement, more time on the platform?
Means richer user data, which means better ad targeting, which makes the brands who advertise there very happy. It's all about strengthening that conversion funnel.
Meanwhile, Meta's big rival, TikTok, is basically copying another one of Meta's platforms, Instagram. They're launching something called bulletin boards.
Yeah, bulletin boards are a direct clone of Instagram's broadcast channels. It gives big creators, the Jonas Brothers are one of the first to use it, a way to share exclusive text, images, videos directly with their most dedicated followers.
So it's a way to bypass the main algorithm.
It's a direct-to-follower communication line. In today's creator economy, that kind of reliable reach is everything. The algorithm can be fickle. This guarantees that your superfans see your content.
It's a retention tool for TikTok. Keep the biggest stars on your platform.
Exactly. It's all about giving them the tools they need to engage with their audience and, make money.
The competition is also heating up in a different area. Visual search. Google is now taking a direct shot at Pinterest.
Google is rolling out a dedicated inspirational images tab in its mobile app. Using its machine learning, it's promising these highly curated, personalized visual feeds for things like home decor, recipes, fashion.
The exact stuff people use Pinterest for.
The exact stuff. It's a direct attempt to peel users away from what has long been the default digital mood board for the entire internet.
But the challenge there isn't just the tech, it's user habits, right? People are used to going to Pinterest for that.
It's a huge hurdle. Pinterest has really strong network effects. People have their boards saved, they follow specific creators. Google has to convince people that its algorithm can give them a better, more inspiring experience.
Yeah.
And that's tough when people are already feeling a bit of feature fatigue.
Right. You don't want another app that does the same thing.
You need a compelling reason to switch.
Okay. From the apps we use every day to the engine room of the future, artificial intelligence. Google just announced a huge step toward general AI with something called the SIMA 2 agent.
SIMA stands for Scalable Instructable Multi-World Agent. And SIMA 2 uses Google's big Gemini AI architecture to make complex decisions in all kinds of different virtual environments.
And the key term you used there was generalist AI? How is that different from the AIs we're used to hearing about, like the ones that can play chess or Go?
So a narrow AI, like AlphaGo, is a genius at one specific defined task. It can beat any human at Go, but it can't, make you a cup of coffee. A generalist AI, like SIMA 2, is different. It can understand natural language commands, it can just tell it what to do, and then it can figure out how to execute those commands across different and even previously unseen scenarios.
So it can learn a skill in one game and apply it to a totally new one.
That's the goal. Its ability to generalize knowledge is a really significant step towards what's called artificial general intelligence, or AGI. That's the long-term, holy grail goal of creating human-level or beyond human-level intelligence.
And we're seeing AI get integrated into our professional lives, too. LinkedIn is now using it for job searching.
LinkedIn has rolled out an AI-powered search for its premium users in the US. Instead of just using keywords, you can now use natural language.
So you can be much more specific.
Much more. You can type in a whole paragraph. I'm looking for a senior marketing role in the fintech space. It has to be fully remote and focused on B2B lead generation.
That does sound a lot better than just typing marketing manager. But is it any good yet?
The early feedback is a bit mixed. The concept is fantastic, but some users are saying the accuracy of the results isn't quite there yet. The matches can be a little inconsistent.
So the AI is still learning how to translate our complex human desires into precise search results.
It is, but it's an inevitable direction for career management. This is where it's all headed.
All right, now for a moment of comedic relief from the tech world, OpenAI has apparently fixed the M-dash problem.
Slight chuckle. The dreaded M-dash. It became this running joke online. It was the easiest way to tell if something was written by ChatGPT.
Because it would just be littered with these long hyphens.
Everywhere. The text would just be full of them. It looked like it was written by a Victorian novelist, and it made the prose feel so unnatural and instantly recognizable as AI.
And the CEO, Sam Altman, actually commented on this.
He did. He called the fix a happy win, which is just a great way to put it. He acknowledged that even though it's a minor stylistic thing, it was a huge drag on the perceived quality and authenticity of the AI's writing.
It's a sign that they're moving beyond just raw intelligence and into the subtleties of human style.
Exactly. The mimicry is getting better.
Now let's talk about what powers all of this.
Yeah.
The massive, massive energy demands of these AI models. And Sam Altman is involved here too, backing a startup called Exawatt.
Exawatt is trying to solve what might be the biggest bottleneck for the future of AI. Clean, reliable, 247 power for data centers. Their solution is a modular solar thermal energy system they call P3.
Solar thermal. So they're capturing heat, not just converting sunlight directly to electricity with a panel.
Right. And this is where the billions of hot rocks comes in. The brilliant part of their system is the energy storage.
So they're not using big, expensive lithium-ion batteries.
No. They capture solar energy as heat during the day, and they store that heat in these huge insulated containers filled with, well, rocks, an abundant, super cheap material. Then whenever you need power, day or night, you use that stored heat to run a generator.
That sounds incredibly simple and cost-effective.
That's the goal. It's incredibly ambitious. They are targeting a price of 1 cent per kilowatt hour over time. That is That's revolutionary.
1 cent. Wow.
They're backed by $90 million in funding, and they're positioning this as the sustainable answer to the exponential energy thirst of AI.
Finally, in this section, let's look at how digital connectivity is driving a big cultural shift in Latin America and the Caribbean, specifically through online gaming.
Online gaming has just completely exploded across the region, and the main reason is the high penetration of mobile internet.
Everyone has a powerful computer in their pocket.
Exactly. Data shows that 60 to 65% of the population is using mobile internet, which makes smartphone gaming super accessible. It's become a routine part of social life.
And what are the economic effects of that boom?
It's fueling a lot of digital commerce, new jobs. And we're starting to see governments catch up. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico are developing regulatory frameworks to make sure it's all safe and fair for consumers.
So it's maturing from just entertainment into a real part of the digital economy.
A core part of the digital, social, and commercial fabric of the region, yeah.
Okay, let's move on to Earth systems and focus on one of the most visible casualties of climate change, our coral reefs. There's a new study that details the threat to the really critical staghorn coral.
The study looked at Acroporus cervicornis, that's staghorn coral, which is a key reef-building species in the Atlantic. And what scientists did was look at how it responds to different environmental pressures or stressors.
And what did they learn about how those stressors interact?
They confirmed the devastating power of what they call synergistic stress. It's a deadly combination.
What were the specific threats they tested?
They looked at two main ones: high levels of nitrogen and ammonium, which you get from agricultural runoff and wastewater, and also disease. But what they saw was that if a coral had to deal with just one of those things, either the pollution or the disease, some of the more resilient ones could often cope. They could survive.
But when you hit them with both at the same time?
It's lethal. The combined effect is exponentially worse than just adding the two problems together.
So it's not 1 + 1 = 2, it's 1 + 1 = 10.
That's a great way to think about it. The organism's ability to defend itself or repair damage just completely collapses. It's overwhelmed.
And this research ties directly back to human activity and climate change.
Absolutely. The nutrient runoff is a local pollution problem, but it's made so much worse by the global climate problem. Rising ocean temperatures are bleaching and weakening the coral already, and then you add ocean acidification from all the carbon in the atmosphere, which makes it harder for them to even build their skeletons.
So you have this deadly cocktail of heat, acid, and pollution.
And the result is rapid, widespread death across entire reef systems.
On the corporate side of this, we see the aerospace giant Boeing trying to do something about its own environmental impact with a pretty big carbon removal deal.
Yeah. Boeing signed a deal to purchase up to 100,000 metric tons of carbon removal from a startup called Charm Industrial. This is a big strategic move for the aviation industry, which is under a ton of pressure to decarbonize.
So how does Charm Industrial actually remove the carbon? What's their process?
They use a process called pyrolysis. They take agricultural waste-like corn stalks, things that would normally just rot and release CO2 back into the atmosphere, and they heat it without oxygen.
And that turns it into what?
It turns it into a stable, carbon-rich bio-oil. And then, this is the crucial part, they inject that bio-oil deep underground into geological formations for permanent storage.
So this isn't just an offset like planting trees that might burn down. This is true, verifiable removal.
It's true removal, yeah. And it helps Boeing meet its long-term climate targets. It also signals a real maturing of the carbon market. Big companies are moving beyond abstract credits and investing in technologies that physically pull carbon out of the air.
Now let's look at clean energy policy at the state level in the U.S. There's a program in Pennsylvania called Solar for Schools. It sounds like a great bipartisan idea, but it's hitting some classic roadblocks.
The program set aside $25 million for K-12 schools to install solar panels. It's a total win-win. It lowers electricity costs for schools that are always short on cash, it creates local jobs, and it's great for education.
And the potential here is pretty big, right?
The potential is massive. Research suggests that if you put solar panels on the rooftops of schools, warehouses, and other big buildings, you could generate anywhere from 10 to 35% of Pennsylvania's entire solar capacity by 2030.
That is a huge amount of clean energy. So if the potential is there and the politicians agree, what's the bottleneck?
The sources point to two big problems. First, the funding was way too small. That $25 million was vastly oversubscribed, which shows how much demand there is.
And the second problem?
The second problem is the crippling backlog in getting these projects connected to the energy grid. The utility companies move incredibly slowly. They cite concerns about grid stability. They require these long, expensive studies.
It's bureaucratic inertia.
It's a bureaucratic drag that is slowing down solar adoption all across the state, even for small projects. You have the policy ambition, but it's running headlong into regulatory reality.
A classic story. Finally, for this section, the UK is bracing for some immediate, serious weather.
Yeah, amber weather warnings are in effect for Storm Claudia across parts of the United Kingdom. They're predicting heavy, persistent rain.
And an amber warning means what? High risk.
It means a heightened risk of widespread flooding and significant disruption to travel and infrastructure. It's just another one of those somber, immediate reminders of the increasing frequency and intensity of the extreme weather events that we all have to manage now.
Turning now to global politics and governance. Let's start in the U.S., where a record-long government shutdown has finally come to an end.
President Donald Trump signed the funding bill that ended the 43-day shutdown, allowing federal agencies to get back to normal.
Which is obviously a huge relief for the federal workers who went weeks without pay.
A huge relief. But the underlying problem, the structural dysfunction in how budget negotiations happen, that remains a pretty crucial, unresolved political issue.
Elsewhere, the incredibly complex saga of Jeffrey Epstein continues to have political fallout, fueling these debates about accountability for powerful people. We have a few different disclosures here.
And we should report these factually. New emails have emerged that suggest Donald Trump might have had, quote, prior knowledge of the girl's activities.
And at the same time, other communications were released.
That's right. Separate emails show that Epstein was offering political strategy advice to his associates back in 2018 on how to best handle President Trump politically.
And the president himself has responded to all of this by going on the offensive.
He has. President Trump announced that he intends to launch investigations into other high-profile figures and institutions. He specifically named Hillary Clinton, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, and J.P. Morgan for their own connections to Epstein.
So regardless of the truth of any single claim, what's the big picture here? What's the takeaway?
The takeaway is the extreme politicization of these very serious criminal allegations. This constant stream of revelations just keeps the topic of elite accountability front and center in the political discourse, and it reinforces a lot of public skepticism about whether anyone in power is ever truly held responsible.
Just a quick constitutional point that comes up in these debates. Who actually has the power to tax in the U.S.?
The Constitution is very clear on this. Article I gives the power to levy and collect taxes solely to Congress.
So the legislative branch.
Right. Now, the president has a lot of leverage, especially with things like international tariffs or in specific emergencies defined by Congress. But the fundamental authority to write and approve tax law rests with them, not the White House.
And looking ahead to the next election cycle, the Republican strategy seems to be taking shape.
It is. We're seeing reports that J.D. Vance, the influential Republican senator from Ohio, is planning to meet with President Trump to discuss his own potential presidential ambitions.
And this meeting is significant because
Vance is a key figure in the populist wing of the party. And for anyone with ambitions, getting alignment with the base that President Trump commands is absolutely critical. It signals that loyalty and base support are still the most important currencies in the party.
Okay, let's cross the Atlantic to the UK, where the government is planning a major change to how the police are governed.
The plan is to completely abolish police and crime commissioners, or PCCs, across England and Wales. The government says this will save about £100 million and streamline the bureaucracy.
Remind us what PCCs do. They were a fairly recent creation, weren't they?
They were, introduced back in 2012. The idea was to increase local accountability by letting the public directly elect an official who would set the local police budget and priorities.
So why scrap them if the goal was accountability?
The argument for scrapping is that they've been a failure. Supporters of the move point out that less than 20% of voters can even name their local PCC, so they argue that the whole experiment in direct accountability just didn't work.
And the argument against abolishing them?
Critics are worried that it will undermine local control over policing. They fear it will lead to more centralization of power in London and disconnect police services from the actual needs of local communities.
Sticking with UK politics, we have some news from inside the ruling Labour Party.
There's confirmation that Morgan McSweeney, who is Keir Starmer's chief of staff, is going to be staying in his role. This comes after some controversy and what was called a briefing war that suggested there was some internal tension.
And McSweeney is a pretty important figure.
He's seen as the pivotal strategist, the architect behind Labour's recent election victory. He's known for this very data-driven approach and for keeping a strong connection to the party's grassroots base. So him staying signals stability at the very top of the government.
And on the economic front, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has made a change to her tax plans.
Yes, she's backed away from earlier plans to increase income tax rates. This is in response to better-than-expected economic forecasts.
So she's showing some flexibility.
She is. It lets the government stick to its big manifesto promise of being fiscally responsible without having to use a politically unpopular tax hike to do it. It's a sign of them adjusting their policy based on the latest data.
And finally, let's go to India, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi's coalition just had a major election victory.
His National Democratic Alliance, the NDA, which is led by his BJP party, secured a really decisive majority in the state elections in Bihar, which is a very important state.
And Modi's framing this as a vote for his agenda.
He is. He attributed the victory to the public's desire for development and good governance.
Was there anything particularly notable about the voter data in this election?
Yes, the turnout among female voters was a record 71.6%. That's a huge number. And it's often linked to the success of specific government welfare programs that are targeted directly at women. It shows that kind of targeted spending can be a very effective electoral strategy.
And Modi is already looking ahead to the next fight.
He's already signaled that the BJP's next big target is the state of West Bengal. He vowed to, quote, uproot jungle Raj there, which is very strong language. It sets the stage for a really competitive, hard-fought battle with the strong regional parties there.
In our final section now, let's explore some challenges related to our history, our heritage, and some deep societal crises. Let's start with the illicit trade in cultural artifacts.
This is a massive global criminal enterprise. It's often estimated to be right up there financially with arms and drug trafficking.
But with much less regulation and enforcement.
Far less. And the consequences are just devastating. You're stripping entire communities of their physical history, you're funding organized crime, and you're destroying the historical context of these objects forever.
Are law enforcement bodies making any progress against it?
They are stepping up their efforts. Interpol and various customs agencies work together across 23 countries and managed to seize over 37,000 cultural objects last year.
What kind of things are we talking about?
All sorts. Ancient coins from conflict areas like Ukraine, thousands of Roman coins that were looted from a site in Spain. It's a huge range.
And what about new strategies beyond just seizing things at the border?
UNESCO, that's the UN's Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, they're really leaning into technology and education. They've launched a virtual museum of stolen cultural objects.
A virtual museum? How does that help?
It uses these high-definition 3D replicas of stolen artifacts. It helps educate the public, but more importantly, it establishes this undeniable public record of what was stolen, which can be crucial in efforts to get the real object back. They're also exploring things like blockchain to create these unchangeable digital records of an artifact's legitimate history.
And just as a poignant historical note, we have an item from the Titanic up for auction.
The watch that belonged to Isidor Straus, who was the co-founder of the Macy's department store. It survived the sinking in 1912 and is expected to sell for up to £1 million.
And he and his wife have that famous story.
They do. A story of enduring love. He and his wife, Ida, they famously refused to be separated. They gave up their spots on the lifeboats and chose to stay together on the sinking ship. The watch is just a symbol of those incredible personal stories that are tied up in these huge historical disasters.
Let's move now to a deeply troubling societal crisis: child protection. The review into the tragic death of a 10-year-old girl, Sarah Sharif, has revealed some serious systemic failures.
The review confirmed 5 critical failings by the authorities involved, and it stressed that, quote, different actions could and should have been taken that might have prevented her death.
And this went beyond just simple mistakes or procedural errors.
Much deeper. The report identified 2 really critical institutional problems.
What were they?
First, a crippling lack of trust between the community and law enforcement. That probably led to people being reluctant to report concerns or cooperate fully. And second, there were deeply worrying questions about potential racism within the child protection system itself.
So the suggestion is that biases might have affected how her case was handled.
Right. The biases may have impacted how the authorities assessed the risks she was facing, and that may have prevented the kind of timely, effective intervention that was needed. It's a call for some significant, culturally sensitive reform to rebuild that trust.
We're also seeing a crisis in the healthcare system, highlighted by the recent strike by resident doctors.
The health secretary, Wes Streeting, publicly condemned a 5-day strike by resident doctors. He used very strong language, saying it was inflicting pain and misery on patients and putting even more strain on the already struggling National Health Service, the NHS.
It's a terrible tension, isn't it?
It is. The tension between the doctor's legitimate demands for better pay and conditions in a system that's at the breaking point, and the absolute moral imperative to care for patients who are suffering.
Finally, we have two high-profile public safety incidents that have sparked some debate about accountability.
The first was in Stockholm, Sweden, where there was a tragic bus crash into a bus stop that resulted in several deaths, and that immediately raised concerns about urban transport safety.
And the second was a legal ruling in the UK.
Yes, a very complex ruling that cleared a Royal Escort motorcyclist, an officer named PC Christopher Harrison, in the death of a pedestrian.
And that ruling was controversial. Why?
Because even though the court found he didn't act with criminal negligence, it sparked this huge public debate about the high-speed protocols that police use when they're in these high-pressure protection roles. It really questions the balance between what's operationally necessary to protect a VIP and the standard of accountability you need when that action results in a civilian's death.
Before we wrap up, let's touch on a strange intersection of pop culture and public health, what's being called the White Lotus effect.
Slight chuckle. It sounds like a joke, but it's a real thing. A study found that the HBO series, The White Lotus, led to a measurable and pretty concerning spike in online searches for risky anxiety medications.
So people watch the show and then go look up the drugs the characters are taking.
Exactly. The concern from health experts is that the show's very stylized, dramatic portrayal of mental health issues and prescription drug use might inadvertently glamorize or normalize using these powerful drugs without talking to a doctor first. It's a fascinating, if worrying, example of how entertainment can shape our health perceptions.
It really is. And finally, in sports, we see geopolitics just crashing headlong into the idea of athletic neutrality.
The Russian Olympic champion gymnast, Angelina Melnikova, she signed a contract with the German club. And this is hugely controversial because Ukraine had previously branded her champion of terror for her very vocal support of President Vladimir Putin and the war.
And the German club's defense is what? That she's competing as a neutral athlete.
They're relying on the International Gymnastics Federation guidelines that allow athletes from sanctioned countries to compete without their national flag. But her very public history of supporting the war makes that neutral status, well, highly contested.
It really highlights how difficult, maybe impossible, it is to keep politics out of sports during a major international conflict.
It absolutely does. It puts the club and the sport in a very politically charged spotlight.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, from the U.S. military looking for a strategic edge in lunar space, to the huge leap toward artificial general intelligence with SIMA 2, all the way to the constitutional rules that brought down the German government over wartime aid.
It's been a deep dive that's really unified by two big forces, I think. You have this accelerating technological power on one hand, and these persistent challenges in governance on the other.
You see that tension everywhere.
Everywhere. The speed of AI development versus the slow pace of making policy, the immediate need for wartime spending clashing with rigid fiscal rules, the urgency of climate change hitting these bureaucratic delays.
And that leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you to take with you. We saw the German political system break because of its constitutional debt break. We saw the UK getting ready to scrap its PCC system because of a lack of public engagement. And that horrific Sarah Sharif review exposed deep institutional failings rooted in a lack of trust.
So when these 21st century crises hit, and they can be anything from a climate disaster to a war to a disruptive new technology, our political institutions are often still running on a 20th century operating system. They were designed for stability, not for speed or radical flexibility.
So the question is, do our existing, often rigid domestic structures even have the agility needed to keep pace with the velocity of today's world?
Or do we have to accept that governance itself needs some kind of radical structural reform just to be able to match the speed of the global news cycle?
That is the essential challenge facing every major democracy today. Thank you for diving deep with us. Until next time, keep exploring those complexities.
Enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.